scene of operations. Only a rustling denoted that others had preceded them, to which, as the light increased, there were presently added the silhouettes of two men on the summit. They were busily unhailing the rick, that is, stripping off the thatch before beginning to throw down the sheaves, and while this was in progress, and Tess and the other women workers in their whitey brown pinners stood waiting and shivering, Farmer Groby having insisted upon their being on the spot thus early to get the job over, if possible, by the end of the day. Close under the eaves of the stack, and as yet barely visible, was the red tyrant that the women had come to serve, a timber-framed construction with straps and wheels appertaining. The threshing machine which, whilst it was going, kept up a despotic demand upon the endurance of their muscles and nerves. A little way off there was another indistinct figure, this one black, with a sustained hiss that spoke of strength, very much in reserve. The long chimney running up beside an ash tree, and the warmth which radiated from the spot, explained, without the necessity of much daylight, that here was the engine which was to act as the primum mobile of this little world. By the engine stood a dark, motionless being, a sooty and grimy embodiment of tallness in a sort of trance, with a heap of coals by his side. It was the engine man. The isolation of his manner and colour lent him the appearance of a creature from Tovet, who had strayed into the pellucid smokelessness of this region of yellow grain and pale soil, with which he had nothing in common to amaze and discompose its apparitions. What he looked, he felt. He was in the agricultural world, but not of it. He served fire and smoke. These denizens of the fields served vegetation, weather, frost, and sun. He travelled with his engine from farm to farm, from country to country, for as yet the steam threshing machine was itinerant in this part of Wessex. He spoke in a strange northern accent, his thoughts being turned inwards upon himself, his eye on his iron charge, hardly perceiving the scenes around him, and caring for them not at all, holding only strictly necessary intercourse with the natives, as if some ancient doom compelled him to wander here against his will in the service of his plutonic master. The long strap which ran from the driving wheel of his engine to the red thresher under the rick was the sole tie line between agriculture and him. While they uncovered the sheaves, he stood apathetic beside his portable repository of force, round whose hot blackness the morning air quivered. He had nothing to do with his preparatory labour. His fire was waiting incandescent. His steam was at high pressure. In a few seconds he could make the long strap move at an invisible velocity. Beyond its extent, the environment might be corn, straw, or chaos. It was all the same to him. If any of the noticed idlers asked him what he called himself, he replied shortly, an engineer. The rick was unhauled by full daylight. The men then took their places. The women mounted, and the work began. Farmer Groby, or as they called him, he, had arrived ere this, and by his orders Tess was placed on the platform of the machine, close to the man who fed it, her business being to untie every sheaf of corn handed on to her by his Hewitt. who stood next, but on the rick, so that the feeder could seize it up and spread it over the revolving drum, which whisked out every grain in one moment. They were soon in full progress, after a preparatory hitch or two, which rejoiced the hearts of those who hated machinery. The work sped on till breakfast time, when the thresher was stopped for half an hour, and, on starting again after the meal, the whole supplementary strength of the farm was thrown into the labour of constructing the straw rick, which began to grow it beside the stack of corn. A hasty lunch was eaten as they stood without leaving their positions, and then another couple of hours brought them near to dinner time, the inexorable wheels continuing to spin, and the penetrating hum of the thresher to thrill at the very marrow all who were near the revolving wire cage. The old men on the rising straw rick talked of the past days when they had been accustomed to threshing with flails on the oaken barn floor, when everything, even to winnowing, was effected by hand labour, which, to their thinking, though slow, produced better results. Those two on the corn rick talked a little, but the perspiring ones at the machine, including Tess, could not lighten their duties by the exchange of many words. It was the ceaselessness of the work which tried her so severely, and began to make her wish that she had never come to Flintcomash. The women on the corn rick, Marianne, who was one of them in particular, could stop to drink ale or cold tea from the flagon now and then, or to exchange a few gossiping remarks while they wiped their faces or cleared the fragments of straw and husk from their clothing. But for Tess there was no respite, for as the drum never stopped, the man who fed it could not stop, and she who had to supply the man who untied sheaves could not stop either. For some probably economical reason, it was usually a woman who was chosen for this particular duty, and Groby gave as his motive in selecting Tess that she was one of those who best combined strength with quickness in untying, and both with staying power, and this may have been true. The hum of the thresher, which prevented speech, increased to a raving whenever the supply of corn fell short of the regular quantity. As Tess and the man who fed could never turn their heads, she did not know that just before the dinner hour a person had come silently into the field by the gate, and had been standing under a second rick watching the scene, and Tess in particular. He was dressed in a tweed suit of fashionable pattern, and he twirled a gay walking cane. "Who is that?" said Hewitt to Marianne. She had at first addressed the inquiry to Tess, but the latter could not hear it. "Somebody's fancy man, I suppose," said Marianne laconically. "I'll lay a guinea he's after Tess." "Oh no, 'tis Ron her parson, who's been sniffing after her lately. Not a dandy like this." "Well, this is the same man." "The same man as the preacher, but he's quite different. He have left off his black coat and white neckerchief, and have cut off his whiskers, but he's the same man for all that." "Do you really think so? Then I'll tell her," said Marianne. "Don't. She'll see him soon enough." "Well, I don't think it's at all right for him to join his preaching to courting a married woman, even though her husband may be abroad, and she, in a sense, a widow." "Oh, he can do her no harm," said Is dryly. "Her mind can no more be heaved from that one place where it do bide than a studded wagon from the hole he's in. Lord lovey, neither court playing, nor preaching, nor the seven thunders themselves can shake a woman when 'twould be better for her than she should be shaken." Dinner time came, and the whirling ceased, whereupon Tess left her post, her knees trembling as I've done, said Marianne. You wouldn't look so white then. Why, souls above us, your face is as if you'd been aggroed. It occurred to the good-natured Marianne that, as Tess was so tired, her discovery of her visitor's presence might have the bad effect of taking away her appetite, and Marianne was thinking of inducing Tess to descend by a ladder on the farther side of the stack when the gentleman came forward and looked up. Tess uttered a short little "oh," and a moment after she said quickly, I shall eat my dinner here, right on the rick. Sometimes, when they were so far from their cottages, they all did this, but as there was rather a keen wind going today, Marianne and the rest descended and sat under the straw stack. The newcomer was, indeed, Alec d'Urberville, the late evangelist, despite his change of attire and aspect. It was obvious at a glance that the original Weltlust had come back, that he had restored himself as nearly as a man could do who had grown 3 or 4 years older, to the old jaunty slapdash guise under which Tess had first known her admirer and cousin so-called. Having decided to remain where she was, Tess sat down among the bundles, out of sight of the ground, and began her meal, till by and by she heard footsteps on the ladder, and immediately after Alec appeared upon the stack, now an oblong and level platform of sheaves. He strode across them and sat down opposite to her, without a word. Tess continued to eat her modest dinner, a slice of thick pancake which she had brought with her. The other workfolk were, by this time, all gathered under the rick, where the loose straw formed a comfortable retreat. I am here again, as you see, said d'Urberville. Why do you trouble me so? She cried, reproach flashing from her very finger ends. I trouble you? I think I may ask, why do you trouble me? Indeed, I don't trouble you. You say you don't, but you do. You haunt me. Those very eyes that you turned upon me with such a bitter flash a moment ago, they come to me just as you showed them then, in the night and in the day. Tess, ever since you told me of the child, it is just as if my emotions, which have been flowing in a strong stream heavenward, had suddenly found a sluice open in the direction of you, through which they have at once gushed. The gospel channel is left dry forthwith, and it is you who have done it. You. She gazed with parted lips. What, you have given up your preaching entirely? She asked. She had gathered from Angel sufficient of the incredulity of modern thought to despise flash enthusiasms, but as a woman she was somewhat appalled. In affected lightness, d'Urberville continued. Entirely. I've broken every engagement since that afternoon I was to address the drunkards at Casterbridge Fair. The deuce only knows what I am thought of by the brethren. Ah, the brethren. No doubt they pray for me, weep for me, for they are kind people in their way. But what do I care? How could I go on with the thing when I had lost my faith in it? It would have been hypocrisy of the basest kind. Among them I should have stood like Hymenaeus and Alexander, who were delivered over to Satan, that they might learn not to blaspheme. What a grand revenge you have taken! I saw you innocent, and I deceived you. 3.5 years after, you find me a Christian enthusiast. You then work upon me, perhaps to my complete perdition. But Tess, my coz, as I used to call you, this is only my way of talking, and you must not look so horribly concerned. Of course, you have done nothing except retain your pretty face and shapely figure. I saw it on the rick before you saw me. That tight pinafore thing set sets it off, and that wing bonnet. You field girls should never wear those bonnets if you wish to keep out of danger. He regarded her silently for a few moments, and, with a short, cynical laugh, resumed. I believe that if the bachelor apostle, whose deputy I thought I was, had been tempted by such a pretty face, he would have let go the plough, for her sake, as I do. Tess attempted to expostulate, but at this juncture, all her fluency failed her, and without heeding, he added, Well, this paradise that you supply is perhaps as good as any other, after all. But to speak seriously, Tess. D'Urberville rose and came nearer, reclining sideways amid the sheaves and resting upon his elbow. Since I last saw you, I have been thinking of what you said, that he said. I have come to the conclusion that there does seem rather a want of common sense in these threadbare old propositions. How I could have been so fired by poor Parson Clare's enthusiasm, and have gone so madly to work, transcending even him, I cannot make out. As for what you said last time, on the strength of your wonderful husband's intelligence, whose name you have never told me, about having what they call an ethical system without any dogma, I don't see my way to that at all. Why, you can have the religion of loving kindness and purity at least, if you can't have, what do they call it, dogma? Oh no, I'm a different sort of fellow from that. If there's nobody to say, do this, and it will be a good thing for you after you are dead, do that, and it will be a bad thing for you. I can't warm up. Hang it, I am not going to feel responsible for my deeds and passions if there's nobody to be responsible to. And if I were you, my dear, I wouldn't either. She tried to argue and tell him that he had mixed in his dull brain two matters, theology and morals, which, in the primitive days of mankind, had been quite distinct. But, owing to Angel Clare's reticence, to her absolute want of training, and to her being a vessel of emotions rather than reasons, she could not get on. Well, never mind, he resumed. Here I am, my love, as in the old times. Not as then, never as then. It is different, she entreated, and there was never warmth with me. Oh, why didn't you retain your faith, if the loss of it have brought E to speak to me like this? Because you've knocked it out of me, so the evil be upon your sweet head. Your husband little thought how his teaching would recoil upon him. I'm awfully glad you've made an apostate of me all the same. Tess, I am more taken with you than ever, and I pity you too. For all your closeness, I see you are in a bad way, neglected by one who ought to cherish you. She could not get her morsels of food down her throat. Her lips were dry, and she was ready to choke. The voices and laughs of the workfolk, eating and drinking under the rake, came to her as if they were a quarter of a mile off. It is cruelty to me, she said. How can you treat me to this talk, if you care ever so little for me? True, he said, wincing a little. I did not come to reproach you for my fall. I came, Tess, to say that I don't like you to be working like this, and I have come on purpose for you. You say you have a husband who is not I. Well, perhaps you have, but I've never seen him, and you've not told me his name, and altogether he seems rather a mythological personage. However, even if you have one, I think I am nearer to you than he is. I, at any rate, try to help you out of trouble, but he does not, bless his invisible face. The words of the stern prophet, Hosea, that I used to read come back to me. Don't you know them, Tess? And and she shall follow after her lover, but she shall not overtake him, and she shall seek him, but shall not find him. Then shall she say, I will go, and return to my first husband, for then was it better with me than now. Tess, my trap is waiting just under the hill, and, darling mine, not his, you know the rest. Her face had been rising to a dull crimson fire while he spoke, but she did not answer. You have been the cause of my backsliding, he continued jauntily. You should be willing to share it, and leave that mule you call husband forever. One of her leather gloves, which she had taken off to eat her skimmer cake, lay in her lap, and, without the slightest warning, she passionately swung the glove by the gauntlet directly in his face. It was heavy and thick as a warrior's, and it struck him flat on the mouth. Fancy might have regarded the act as the recrudescence of a trick in which her male progenitors were not unpracticed. Alec fiercely started up from his reclining position. A scarlet oozing appeared where her blow had alighted, and, in a moment, the blood began dropping from his mouth upon the straw. But he soon controlled himself, calmly drew his handkerchief from his pocket, and mopped his bleeding lips. She too had sprung up, but she sank down again. Now punish me, she said, turning up her eyes to him with the hopeless defiance of the sparrow's gaze before its captor twists its neck. Whip me, crush me, you need not mind those people under the rig. I shall not cry out. Once victim, always victim, that's the law. Oh no, Tess, he said blandly. I can make full allowance for this. Yet, you must unjustly forget one thing, that I would have married you if you had not put it out of my power to do so. Did I not ask you flatly to be my wife? Hey, answer me. You did, and you cannot be. But remember one thing. His voice hardened as his temper got the better of him with the recollection of his sincerity in asking her and her present ingratitude, and he stepped across to her side and held her by the shoulders, so that she shook under his grasp. Remember, I was your master once. I will be your master again. If you are any man's wife, you are mine. The threshers now began to stir below. So much for our quarrel, he said, letting her go. Now, I shall leave you, and shall come again for your answer during the afternoon. You don't know me yet, but I know you. She had not spoken again, remaining as if stunned. D'Urberville retreated over the sheaves and descended the ladder, while the workers below rose and stretched their arms and shook down the beer they had drunk. Then the threshing machine started afresh, and, amid the renewed rustle of the straw, Tess resumed her position by the buzzing drum, as one in a dream, untying sheaf after sheaf in endless succession. Chapter 48. In the afternoon, the farmer made it known that the rick was to be finished that night, since there was a moon by which they could see to work, and the man with the engine was engaged for another farm on the morrow. Hence the twanging and humming and rustling proceeded with even less intermission than usual. It was not till Namit time, about 3 o'clock, that Tess raised her eyes and gave a momentary glance round. She felt but little surprise at seeing Alec d'Urberville had come back and was standing under the hedge by the gate. He had seen her lift her eyes and waved his hand urbanely to her, while he blew her a kiss. It meant that their quarrel was over. Tess at once looked down again, and carefully abstained from gazing in that direction. Thus the afternoon dragged on. The wheat rick shrank lower, and the straw rick grew higher, and the corn sacks were carted away, whose neck was covered with husks. She still stood at her post, her flushed and perspiring face coated with the corn dust, and her white bonnet embrowned by it. She was the only woman whose place was upon the machine, so as to be shaken bodily by its spinning and this incessant quivering, in which every fibre of her body participated, had thrown her into a stupefied reverie, in which her arms worked on independently of her consciousness. She hardly knew where she was, and did not hear Is Hewitt, who, with the sinking of the rick, had necessarily moved farther down from her side, offer to change places with her. By degrees, the freshest among them began to grow cadaverous and saucer-eyed. Whenever Tess lifted her head, she beheld always the great upgrown straw stack, with the men in shirt sleeves upon it, against the grey north sky. In front of it, the long red elevator, like a Jacob's ladder, on which a perpetual stream of threshold straw ascended, a yellow river running uphill and spouting out on the top of the rick. She knew that Alec d'Urberville was still on the scene, observing her from some point or other, though she could not say where. There was an excuse for his remaining, for when the threshed rick drew near its final sheaves, a little ratting was always done, and men unconnected with the threshing sometimes dropped in for that performance, sporting characters of all descriptions, gents with terriers, and facetious pipes, roughs with sticks and stones. But there was another hour's work before the layer of live rats at the base of the stack would be reached, and as the evening light in the direction of the Giant's Hill by Abbott's Greenhill dissolved away, the white-faced moon of the season arose from the horizon that lay towards Middletown Abbey and Shottsford on the other side. For the last hour or two, Marianne had felt uneasy about Tess, whom she could not get near enough to speak to, the other women having kept up their strength by drinking ale, and Tess having done without it through traditionary dread, owing to its result at her home in childhood. But Tess still kept going. If she could not fill her part, she would have to leave, and this contingency, which she would have regarded with equanimity and even with a relief a month or two earlier, had become a terror since d'Urberville had begun to hover round her. The sheaf pitches and feeders had now worked the rick so low that people on the ground could talk to them. To Tess's surprise, former Groby came up on the machine to her, and said that if she desired to join her friend, he did not wish her to keep on any longer, and would send somebody else to take her place. The friend was d'Urberville, she knew, and also that this concession had been granted in obedience to the request of that friend, or enemy. She shook her head and toiled on. The time for the rat-catching arrived at last, and the hunt began. The creatures had crept downwards with the subsidence of the rick, till they were all together at the bottom, and, being now uncovered from their last refuge, they ran across the open ground in all directions. A loud shriek from the by this time half-tipsy Marianne, informing her companions that one of the rats had invaded her person, a terror which the rest of the women had guarded against by various schemes of skirt-tucking and self-elevation. The rat was at last dislodged, and, amid the barking of the dogs, masculine shouts, feminine screams, oaths, stampings, and confusion as of pandemonium, Tess untied her last sheaf. The drum slowed, the whizzing ceased, and she stepped from the bedding to the ground. Her lover, who had only looked on at the rat-catching, was promptly at her side. She was so utterly exhausted that she had not strength to speak louder. I should indeed be foolish to feel offended at anything you say or do, he answered, in the seductive voice of the Tantridge time. How the little limbs tremble. You are as weak as a bled calf. You know you are, and yet you need have done nothing since I arrived. How could you be so obstinate? However, I've told the farmer that he has no right to employ women at steam threshing. It is not proper work for them, and on all the better class of farms it has been given up, as he knows very well. I will walk with you as far as your home. Oh, yes, she answered, with a jaded gait. Walk with me if you will. I do bear in mind that you came to marry me before you knew of my state. Perhaps you be a little better and kinder than I have been thinking you were. Whatever is meant as kindness, I am grateful for. Whatever is meant in other ways, I am angry at. I cannot sense your meaning sometimes. If I cannot legitimize our former relations, at least I can assist you, and I will do it with much more regard for your feelings than I formerly showed. My religious mania, or whatever it was, is over, but I retain a little good nature. I hope I do. Now, Tess, by all that is tender and strong between man and woman, trust me. I have enough, and more than enough, to put you out of anxiety, both for yourself and your parents and sisters. I can make them all comfortable if you will only show confidence in me. Have you seen them lately? She quickly inquired. Yes, they didn't know where you were. It was only by chance that I found you here. The cold moon looked aslant upon Tess's vague face between the twigs of the garden hedge as she paused outside the cottage, which was her temporary home, D'Urberville pausing beside her. Don't mention my little brothers and sisters. Don't make me break down quite, she said. If you want to help them, God knows they need it. Do it without telling me. But no, she cried. I will accept nothing from you, either for them or for me. It did not accompany her farther since, as she lived with the household, all was public indoors. No sooner had she herself entered and mechanically shared supper with the family than she fell into thought, and, withdrawing to the table under the wall, by the light of her own little lamp, wrote in a passionate mood. My own husband, let me call you so. I must, even if it makes you angry to think of such an unworthy wife as I. I must cry to you in my trouble. I have no one else. I am so exposed to temptation, Angel. I fear to say who it is, and I do not like to write about it all, but I cling to you in a way you cannot think. Can you not come to me now, at once, before anything terrible happens? Oh, I know you cannot, because you are so far away. I think I must die if you do not come soon, or tell me to come to you. The punishment you have measured out to me is deserved. I do know that. Well deserved. And you are right and just to be angry with me. But Angel, please, not to be just, only a little kind to me, even if I do not deserve it, and come to me. If you would come, I could die in your arms. I would be well content to do that, if so be you had forgiven me. Angel, I live entirely for you. I love you too much to blame you for coming away, and I know it was necessary, and you should find a farm. Do not think I shall say a word of sting or bitterness. Only come back to me. I am desolate without you, my darling. Oh, so desolate. I do not mind having to work, but if you will send me one little line and say, I am coming soon, I will bide on, Angel. we were married, to be faithful to you in every thought and look, that even when a man speaks a compliment to me before I am aware, it seems wronging you. If you never felt one little bit of what you used to feel when we were at the dairy, if you have, how can you keep away from me? I am the same woman, Angel, as she you fell in love with. Yes, the very same. Not the one you disliked but never saw. What was the past to me as soon as I met you? It was a dead thing altogether. I became another woman, filled full of new life from you. How could I be the early one? Why do you not see this? Dear, if you would only be a little more conceited and believe in yourself so far as to see that you were strong enough to work this change in me, you would perhaps be in a mind to come to me, your poor wife. How silly I was in my happiness when I thought I could trust you to always to love me. I ought to have known that such as that was not for poor me. But I am sick at heart, not only for old times, but for the present. Think how it do hurt my heart not to see you ever. If I could only make your dear heart ache one little minute of each day, as mine does, every day and all day long, it might lead you to show pity for your poor lonely one. People still say that I am rather pretty, Angel. Handsome is the word they use, since I wish to be truthful. Perhaps I am what they say, but I do not value my good looks. I only like to have them because they belong to you, my dear, and that there may be at least one thing about me worth your having. So much have I felt this, that when I met with annoyance on account of the same, I tied up my face in a bandage as long as people would believe in it. Oh, Angel, I tell you all this not from vanity. You will certainly know I do not, but only that you may come to me. If you really cannot come to me, will you let me come to you? I am, as I say, worried, pressed to do what I will not do. It cannot be that I shall yield 1 inch, yet I am in terror as to what an accident might lead to, and I so defenseless on account of my first error. I cannot say more about this, it makes me too miserable, but if I break down by falling into some fearful snare, my last state will be worse than my first. Oh God, I cannot think of it. Let me come at once, or at once come to me. I would be content, glad to live with you as your servant, if I may not as your wife, so that I could only be near you, and get glimpses of you, and think of you as mine. The daylight has nothing to show me, since you be not here, and I don't like to see the rooks and starlings in the fields, because I grieve and grieve to miss you, who used to see them with me. I long for only one thing in heaven or earth, or under the earth, to meet you, my own dear. Come to me, and save me from what threatens me. Your faithful, heartbroken Tess. Chapter 49. The appeal duly found its way to the breakfast table of the quiet vicarage to the westward, in that valley where the air is so soft and the soil so rich that the effort of growth requires but superficial aid by comparison with the tillage at Flintcomash, and where, to Tess, the human world seemed so different, though it was much the same. It was purely for security that she had been requested by Angel to send her communications through his father, whom he kept pretty well informed of his changing addresses in the country he had gone to exploit for himself with a heavy heart. Now, said old Mr. Clare to his wife, when he had read the envelope, hasten his plans, for I believe it to be from his wife. He breathed deeply, and the letter was redirected to be promptly sent on to Angel. "Dear fellow, I hope you will get home safely," murmured Mrs. Clare. "To my dying day, I shall feel that he has been ill-used. You should have sent him to Cambridge, in spite of his heterodoxy, and given him the same chance as the other boys had. He would have grown out of it under proper influence, and perhaps would have taken orders after all. Church or no church, it would have been fairer to him." This was the only wail with which Mrs. Clare ever disturbed her husband's peace in respect of their sons, and she did not vent this often, for she was as considerate as she was devout, and knew that his mind too was troubled by doubts as to his justice in this matter. Only too often had she heard him lying awake at night, stifling sighs for Angel with prayers. But the uncompromising evangelical did not even now hold that he would have been justified in giving his son, an unbeliever, the same academic advantages that he had given the two others, when it was possible, if not probable, that those very advantages might have been used to decry the doctrines which he had made it his life's mission and desire to propagate, and the mission of his ordained sons likewise. To put with one hand a pedestal under the feet of the two faithful ones, and with the other to exalt the unfaithful by the same artificial means, he deemed to be alike inconsistent with his convictions, his position, and his hopes. Nevertheless, he loved his misnamed Angel, and, in secret, mourned over his treatment of him, as Abraham might have mourned over the doomed Isaac, while they went up the hill together. His silent, self-generated regrets were far bitterer than the reproaches which his wife rendered audible. They blamed themselves for this unlucky marriage. If Angel had never been destined for a farmer, he would never have been thrown with agricultural girls. They did not distinctly know what had separated him and his wife, nor the date on which the separation had taken place. At first they had supposed it must be something of the nature of a serious dislike, but in his later letters he occasionally alluded to the intention of coming home to fetch her, from which expressions they hoped the division might not owe its origin to anything so hopelessly permanent as that. He told them that she was with her relatives, and in their doubts they had decided not to intrude into a situation which they knew no way of bettering. The eyes for which Tess's letter was intended were gazing at this time on a limitless expanse of country from the back of a mule which was bearing him from the interior of the South American continent towards the coast. His experiences of this strange land had been sad. The severe illness from which he had suffered shortly after his arrival had never wholly left him, and he had, by degrees, almost decided to relinquish his hope of farming here, though, as long as the bare possibility existed of his remaining, he kept this change of view a secret from his parents. The crowds of agricultural labourers who had come out to the country in his wake, dazzled by representations of easy independence, had suffered, died, and wasted away. He would see mothers from English farms trudging along with their infants in their arms, when the child would be stricken with fever and would die. The mother would pause to dig a hole in the loose earth with her bare hands, would bury the babe therein with the same natural grave tools, shed one tear, and again trudge on. Angel's original intention had not been emigration to Brazil, but a northern or eastern farm in his own country. had come to this place in a fit of desperation, the Brazil movement among the English agriculturalists having by chance coincided with his desire to escape from his past existence. During this time of absence, he had mentally aged a dozen years. What rested him now as a value in life was less its beauty than its pathos. Having long discredited the old systems of mysticism, he now began to discredit the old appraisements of morality. He thought they wanted readjusting. Who was the moral man? Still, more pertinently, who was the moral woman? The beauty or ugliness of a character lay not only in its achievements, but in its aims and impulses. Its true history lay not among things done, but among things willed. How, then, about Tess? Viewing her in these lights, a regret for his hasty judgment began to oppress him. Did he reject her eternally, or did he not? He could no longer say that he would always reject her, and not to say that was in spirit to accept her now. This growing fondness of her memory coincided in point of time with her residence at Flint-Gamash, but it was before she had felt herself at liberty to trouble him with a word about her circumstances or her feelings. He was greatly perplexed, and in his perplexity as to her motives in withholding intelligence, he did not inquire. Thus, her silence of docility was misinterpreted. How much it really said if he had understood that she adhered to the letter to orders which he had given and forgotten, that despite her natural fearlessness, she arrested no rights, admitted his judgment to be in every respect the true one, and bent her head dumbly thereto. In the before-mentioned journey by mules through the interior of the country, another man rode beside him. Angel's companion was also an Englishman, bent on the same errand, though he came from another part of the island. They were both in a state of mental depression, and they spoke of home affairs. Confidence begat confidence, with that curious tendency evinced by men, more especially when in distant lands, to entrust to strangers details of their lives which they would on no account mention to friends. Angel admitted to this man as they rode along the sorrowful facts of his marriage. The stranger had sojourned in many more lands and among many more people than Angel. To his cosmopolitan mind, such deviations from the social norm, so immense to domesticity, were no more than are the irregularities of vale and mountain chain to the whole terrestrial curve. He viewed the matter in quite a different light from Angel, thought that what Tess had been was of no importance beside what she would be, and plainly told Claire that he was wrong in coming away from her. The next day they were drenched in a thunderstorm. Angel's companion was struck down with fever, and died by the week's end. Claire waited a few hours to bury him, and then went on his way. The cursory remark of the stranger, of whom he knew absolutely nothing beyond a comment by his name, were sublimed by his death, and influenced Claire more than all the recent ethics of the philosophers. A remorse struck into him. The words of his Hewitt, never quite stilled in his memory, came back to him. He had asked Is if she loved him, and she had replied in the affirmative. Did she love him more than Tess did? No, she had replied. Tess would lay down her life for him, and she herself could do no more. He thought of Tess as she had appeared on the day of the wedding, how her eyes had lingered upon him, how she had hung upon his words as they were her gods, and during the terrible evening over the hearth, when her simple soul uncovered itself to his, how pitiful her face had looked by the rays of the fire, in her inability to realize that his love and a cynic and live, and he withdrew them. The mistake of expressing them had arisen from his allowing himself to be influenced by general principles to the disregard of the particular instance. But the reasoning is somewhat musty. Lovers and husbands have gone over the ground before today. Claire had been harsh towards her, there is no doubt of it. Men are too often harsh with women they love or have loved. Women with men. And yet these harshnesses are tenderness itself when compared with the universal harshness out of which they grow. The harshness of the population towards the temperament of the means towards the aims of today, towards yesterday, of hereafter, towards today. The historic interest of her family, the masterful line of d'Urbervilles, whom he had despised as a spent force, touched his sentiments now. Why had he not known the difference between the political value and the imaginative value of these things? In the latter quality, her d'Urberville descent was a fact of great dimensions, worthless to economics. It was a most useful ingredient to the dreamer, to the moralizer on declines and falls. It was a fact that would soon be forgotten. The little curiosity about poor Tess's blood and name, and oblivion would fall upon her hereditary link with the marble monuments and leaded skeletons at Kingsburgh. So does time ruthlessly destroy his own romances. In recalling her face again and again, he thought now that he could see therein a flash of the dignity which must have graced her grand dames, and the vision sent that aura through his veins which he had formerly felt, and which left behind it a sense of sickness. Despite her not inviolate past, what still abode in such a woman as Tess outvalued the freshness of her fellows. Was not the gleaming of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? So spoke love, renaissant, preparing the way for Tess's devoted outpouring, which was then just being forwarded to him by his father. Meanwhile, the writer, with an enlarging conviction that Angel would come soon in response to the entreaty, addressed her mind to the tender question of what she could do to please him best when he should arrive. Sighs were expanded on the wish that she had taken more notice of the tunes he played on his harp, and that she had inquired more curiosity of him, which were his favourite ballads among those the country girls sang. She indirectly inquired of Amby Seedling, who had followed Is from Talbothy's, and by chance Amby remembered that, amongst the snatches of melody in which they had indulged at the dairyman's to induce the cows to let down their milk, Claire had seemed to like Cupid's gardens. I have parks, I have hounds, and the break of the day, and had seemed not to care for the tailor's breeches, and such a beauty I did grow, excellent ditties as they were. To perfect the ballads was now her deep desire. She practised them privately at odd moments, especially the break of the day. Arise, 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 and pick your love a posy. All the sweetest flowers that in the garden grow, the turtle doves and small birds in every bow a building, so early in the springtime, at the break of the day. It would have melted the heart of a stone to hear her singing these ditties, whenever she worked apart from the rest of the girls in this cold, dry time, the tears running down her cheeks all the while at the thought that perhaps he would not, after all, come to hear her, and the simple, silly words of the songs resounding in painful mockery of the aching heart of the singer. Tess was so wrapped up in this fanciful dream that she seemed not to know how the season was advancing, that the days had lengthened, that Lady Day was at hand, and would soon be followed by Old Lady Day at the end of her term here. But before the quarter day had quite come, something happened which made Tess think of far different matters. She was at her lodging, as usual one evening, sitting in the downstairs room with the rest of the family, when somebody knocked at the door and inquired for Tess. Through the doorway she saw, against the declining light, a figure with the height of a woman and the breadth of a child, a tall, thin, girlish creature whom she did not recognize in the twilight till the girl said, "Tess." "What? Is it Liza Lou?" asked Tess in startled accents. Her sister, whom a little over a year ago she had left at home as a child, had grown up by a sudden shot to a form of this presentation, of which as yet Lou seemed herself scarce able to understand the meaning. Her thin legs, visible below her once long frock, now short by her growing, and her uncomfortable hands and arms, revealed her youth and inexperience. "Yes, I have been traipsing about all day, Tess," said Lou, with unemotional gravity, "as trying to find 'ee, and I'm very tired." "What is the matter at home?" "Mother is took very bad, and the doctor says she's dying, and as father is not very well either, and says 'tis wrong for a man of such a high family as his to slave and drave at common labouring work. We don't know what to do." Tess stood in reverie a long time before she thought of asking Liza Lou to come in and sit down. When she had done so, and Liza Lou was having some tea, she came to a decision. It was imperative that she should go home. Her agreement did not end till Old Lady Day, the 6th of April, but as interval thereto was not a long one, she had resolved to run the risk of starting at once. To go that night would be a gain of 12 hours, but her sister was too tired to undertake such a distance till the morrow. Tess ran down to where Marianne and Iz lived, informed them of what had happened, and begged them to make the best of her case to the former. Returning, she got Lou a supper, and, after that, having tucked the younger into her own bed, packed up as many of her belongings as would go into a withy basket, and started